For today's video, I'll be sharing my Nerite snail care guide to help other people successfully keep these popular aquatic snails. But, unlike many other popular species in the hobby whose common name refers to a specific variety, species, or even genus, the term Nerite snail actually covers an entire family of aquatic snails. That means that technically every single snail from the Neritidae family falls under the common name of Nerite snail. Thankfully though, in the aquarium hobby, the most commonly kept genera are Neritina, Vittina, Clithon, with Theodoxus and Neritona slowly increasing in popularity, so this does narrow things down a lot. But even within these groups, things can vary, such as water parameter requirements, dietary requirements, and breeding habits, so there's still a few different things to factor in as we work through the video. And just one quick note, I will be showing footage of my fish throughout this video just because it is sometimes difficult to capture my Nerite snails for an extended period of time. So moving on to the appearance, because there's so many different snails that fall under the Nerite snail common name, and there's a huge range of different patterns and colours to choose from. The most common appearance by far is the zebra pattern with the yellow and black lines on the shell of the snail, because that look is quite common in both the Neritina and Vittina genera, with plenty of different species within those having this appearance. This is a photograph of some of the more unique looking species from the Vittina genus of Nerite snail, and if you're getting anything with red or anything like that on the shell, it's probably specifically to this genus. The vast majority of species from the Neritina and Vittina genera are the larger ones within the Nerite snail family, and they usually get to around 4 cm or around 1.5 inches in size. Next up we have the Clithon genus, with the Clithon corona or horned Nerite snail being the most common species from the genus in the hobby. There's currently 4 main varieties of this one in the hobby, with the yellow and brown stripe pattern being the most popular, but there's also an all yellow one, an all black one, and there's a green one that's becoming increasingly popular, but I haven't actually owned the green one myself yet. These guys usually max out at between 1.5 and 2 cm or just under 1 inch in size, so they're a great option for nano tanks. Then there's the Theodoxus genus, and I have no experience with this genus of Nerite snail myself yet, so I am relying on second-hand information for these guys. The river Nerite species from this particular genus has a unique marble pattern with a slightly different swept back shape on its shell compared to most other Nerites in the hobby. These are also quite small and usually get to around 1 cm or just under half an inch, so again they are good for nano tanks if needed. That said, at least some of the species from this genus can be more challenging to feed, and I'll go into that later in the video, so if you are new to aquatic snails, I'd recommend you stick with the Neritina, Vittina or Clithon species instead. Then finally we have the Neritona genus, and there's a lot of contradictory information out there about this specific genus, and as far as I can tell, it's because the majority of the species are marine, and there's only one species in the entire genus that's actually freshwater. From what I understand, the King Cooper species is the only one that can live in freshwater, but again, I haven't personally kept this genus myself either, so I am relying on second-hand information for these guys too. Unfortunately, it is a pain to find any copyright-free photographs of these guys, and this is the best I can do with an empty shell, but it does seem that there's the yellow colour and an all-black colour of the two. Appearance-wise, these are a similar size to river Nerite snails and have that same swept back shell, but they also can have spikes across the entire shell, similar to Clithon snails. So moving on, and we get to tank size, and the genus of Nerite snail you specifically want to keep will largely determine the minimum tank size for the snail. Personally, I think the species of Clithon, Theodoxus and Neritona snails are perfectly fine in nano tanks, which I class as anything under and including 45 litre or 12 US gallon tanks. Their smaller size just means that they need less algae to sustain themselves, so smaller tanks can easily provide everything that they need, and I personally keep Clithon snails in my nano tanks and they've never had an issue. While some sources do suggest that you stock them at 1 snail per 10 litres, you also need to factor in the other things in the tank, such as tank mates. For example, I keep a lot of shrimp in my tanks and they compete with Nerite snails for the same food sources. Because of this, I keep a single Clithon snail in my 30 litre or 80 US gallon endless live bearer tank, and it's worked perfectly well, and the shrimp and snail in that tank are thriving. But if you're looking to keep species of Neritina or Vittina, then I'd recommend that you get a tank that's at least 40 litres or 10 US gallons because they need more food to support their larger size. I do have one zebra Nerite snail from either of those genera in one of my 45 litre or 12 US gallon tanks with a bunch of orange Neocaridina and Armano shrimp, and all of the species seem to be doing well. But the larger your tank size gets, the more food that'll naturally be available in there, so the more of these snails you can add in addition to other algae eaters like different species of shrimp. Moving on, and I do want to touch on Nerite snails escaping their tanks. Now, I'm not saying it's never happened, but I don't actually recall ever having a Nerite snail escape from one of my aquariums. But it is worth pointing out that I never add them to a tank that's still currently cycling with elevated levels of ammonia or nitrite because of their toxicity, and I also make sure there's plenty of food in there. What I have noticed is that after a water top up, Nerite snails will actually climb up to the top of the glass that's just had the water level raised above it, and they'll feed on the grime and calcium deposits left behind by the evaporation. So I do sometimes wonder if that's what people mistake for their Nerite snails attempting to escape the aquarium, but in my experience it's never been an issue. Moving on, and we get to water parameters, and I honestly think this area is an absolute nightmare because there's a lot of conflicting, unreliable information online. As I mentioned earlier, that's because the common name Nerite snail is actually used for the entire family of Nerite Snails, so there's a lot of different species and varieties within there covering a huge range of different habitats. So depending on the specific variety of Nerite snail you're getting, which can be difficult to work out as well, it might be able to survive in very different water parameters to what's commonly recommended. One point that I do see commonly repeated online is that Nerite snails can be very sensitive to chlorine after a water top up. I have seen some research out there that does back this up with other families of snails, so I'm guessing it could be true for Nerites too. Personally, I avoid this by always using the most affordable tap water conditioner product that I can find in my area whenever I add new fresh tap water to my tanks, and I've never had an issue. That's because even the more affordable conditioners on the market will neutralise chlorine and chloramines, as well as help neutralise a lot of heavy metals like copper, which can also be toxic to snails. If you're dosing liquid fertilisers for your aquatic plants, it's worth checking that they are shrimp and or snail safe, because a lot of liquid fertilisers also contain copper. Thankfully, due to the massive increase in the popularity of shrimp keeping in the hobby, all of the liquid fertilisers I've personally seen have been shrimp safe, and they really don't have that much copper in them. Now, I don't use a CO2 system in any of my tanks, but I have seen threads on the UCAP's Aquascaping forum about how some species of Nerite snail can start struggling in high-tech aquariums where CO2 levels are pushed too high. Now, I'm not sure if this is a problem with the CO2 levels itself, or because it causes changes in the carbonate cycle in the tank, leading to different shifts in acidity levels and carbonate levels and things like that, but there does seem to be at least a problem with some species of Nerite snail with tanks with CO2 injection. But if you run low-tech tank setups like me without a CO2 system, this really shouldn't be an issue. When it comes to temperature, the standard advice you'll see online time and time again is anything between 22 and 26 degrees Celsius or 72 and 78 degrees Fahrenheit. While this is a relatively safe general range, it really does depend on the specific species of Nerite snail you're keeping, which can unfortunately be difficult to confirm when you buy them. For example, river Nerites from the Theodoxus genus are native to England, where I live, where the water temperatures during the winter can drop way below those levels, and these snails are perfectly fine. On the other hand, a lot of the more popular Nerite snail species in the hobby are from tropical areas, so sticking with that 22 to 26 degrees Celsius or 72 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit level is probably the safer approach. That said, I've personally kept Clithon snails outside of that water temperature without issue. Next up, we get to pH, and I think this is one of the most controversial things in the hobby when it comes to keeping shrimp and snails. The common advice you see time and time again online is that Nerite snails need to be kept in a pH above 7.0, otherwise their shells will erode and the snail will die. In my experience, and the experience of a lot of other people in the hobby who talk about their Nerite snails on forums and social media, this simply isn't true. I've had some of my Clithon snails live for almost 3 years in my care now in a tank with a pH level between 6.4 and 6.8. I've also found some research papers that do show that at least some varieties of snails are perfectly fine in water with a pH as low as 6.0 as long as there's supplementary sources of calcium in the water. Now, I don't deliberately add calcium supplements to my tanks, but some of the foods that I add for my shrimp and that my snails will also eat do have increased levels of calcium to keep the shrimps healthy. I also want to quickly mention that in my area at least, it is very difficult to get healthy Nerite snails with an intact healthy shell directly from any shop in my area. This is a photograph of some of my recent Nerite snail purchases in the cup that I used to acclimate them, but you can see there's a crack on the snail shell when I first got it. I do think that people may forget the condition of the snail when they buy it and then later see the snail, notice a crack and think they've done something wrong and go online looking for help, but that crack was there when they bought the snail. And that brings me on to GH or general hardness, which usually measures the calcium and magnesium content in your water. My tap water has a GH of 4, but around a third of my current aquariums use Sirius stone or some other type of limestone as the hardscape in the tank, which passively increase calcium levels. But I haven't noticed any real differences in the health of my Nerite snails in tanks with or without these limestone based hardscape rocks that increase the calcium levels. And that brings me on to lifespan, and there's a lot of different sources that do suggest that Nerite snails should only live for 1 or 2 years, but in my experience again that's another generic copy and paste number that doesn't apply to all of the species and varieties in the family. At least with the Clithon snails or horned Nerite snails that I personally have, they do seem to live far longer than this. As I just mentioned, I have at least 3 of the original 6 Clithon snails that I purchased almost 3 years ago, and they weren't little babies when I purchased them either, so they were probably at least 6 months or even more when I actually picked them up. But on the other hand, I have personally struggled to keep species of Neritina or Vittina, which are the larger Nerite snails in the hobby, alive for more than 1 year. I'm not sure if that's just because those specific species don't live as long as Clithon snails, or if it's because my water parameters are better suited to the needs of Clithon snails or something like that, but in my experience the hardier ones are definitely the smaller horned Nerite snails or Clithon snails that you can get. So moving on to feeding and diet, and I want to start by clearing up a common myth that I often see people worry about, and it's that Nerite snails eat healthy plants. I've personally kept multiple species of Nerite snails for almost 3 years now in different heavily planted tanks, and I've never once seen them eat a healthy leaf. What I do think happens is that the snails and shrimp in our tank can start to sense when plants start to cut off nutrients to older leaves and then leave it to decay. So while the leaf may look perfectly fine to our eye, the shrimp and snails in the tank know that it's going to start melting soon, so they start to eat it as quickly as possible. So while it may look like your Nerite snails are eating perfectly healthy leaves, in reality it's just speeding up the decaying process by eating one that's already dying. My advice in this situation would be to just zoom out and look at the other leaves of the plant in your tank and check if the Nerite snails are all eating one leaf of that particular plant or if they're eating all of the leaves. So with that out of the way, I want to move on to algae eating, because this is one of, if not the main reason people add Nerite snails to their tanks. I've personally seen mine eat huge amounts of brown diatom algae and several different types of soft green algae without issue. When it comes to hair algae, I have seen mine crawl across different types of hair algae multiple times, but it is more difficult to see if they're actually eating that or not. That said, I have seen multiple clips online from other creators showing their Nerite snails eating blackbeard algae, so I am confident that they at least eat that specific type of hair algae in aquariums. But it is important to remember that just like shrimp, if there's other easier food sources available like leftover fish food or something like that, your Nerite snails are more likely to go and hunt for that rather than eat the algae in your tank. Another important note is that I've seen multiple sources that say that river Nerite snails from the Theodoxus genus don't take to target feeding well and they will only eat the naturally occurring algae in your tank. As I said earlier, this is a genus that I have no direct experience with, so I am relying on second-hand information for this point, but this would make them more difficult for beginners in my opinion, because you have to set your tank up in a way where you can cultivate enough naturally occurring algae for the snails to eat without it overtaking your tank and making it look ugly. On the other hand, all of my species of Neritina, Vittina and Clithon snails have been very easy to target feed and they've eaten pretty much anything that I've added for them or the shrimp with ease. This includes eating leftover fish food, algae wafers that I intentionally add for them, different types of snail pellets that I've tried but I'm really not a fan of, stuff like shrimp snowflake food that I used to use but I don't use that anymore either. They'll eat leaf litter and cooked vegetables too. With the popularity of snails and shrimp increasing, it does look like more and more people are intentionally adding leaf litter to their tanks as food sources for their invertebrates. In my personal experience, oak and mulberry leaves are by far their favourite for my Nerite snails, my ram's horn snails, my shrimp, both Armano and Neocaridina. My Siamese algae eater loves them as well. I don't know why, there's just something about oak and mulberry leaves that they absolutely love. As I mentioned earlier, they'll also happily eat any decaying plant leaves in your tank, and if any of your fish die without you noticing, they'll eat them surprisingly quickly, so it might seem like your fish magically disappeared. But on the flip side of that, it also helps reduce the chances of an ammonia spike. So based on the species of different Nerite snails I've personally kept, once the initial algae is being eaten and is under control, they are very easy to target feed to help keep them healthy and make sure they have plenty of food in the tank. So moving on, and we get to breeding, because there's a few common misconceptions about Nerite snail breeding in the hobby. The first is the idea that Nerite snails won't breed in freshwater tanks, and this is not true. To my knowledge, all species of Nerite snail will happily breed in freshwater, and they'll often leave their eggs around the hardscape and certain plants in the tank. The second misconception is that their eggs will also calcify onto the plants and hardscape if you leave them there, becoming unsightly over time. My personal theory on this one is that it's going to depend on your tank's water chemistry. If you have softer water like myself, then the eggs simply dissolve and they'll never build up and calcify in your tank, but if you have harder water, then this may become an issue over time. And the third misconception is that no Nerite snail eggs can hatch in fresh water. While this is true for most species because a lot of their eggs require brackish water conditions with a higher salinity content to develop, this is not true for all Nerite snails in the hobby. For example, the river Nerite snail from the Theodoxus genus can lay eggs that will fully develop and hatch in freshwater setups, and the river Nerite snails are seemingly becoming increasingly popular, at least here in Europe, where they are native in our waterways and easier to find. But like I mentioned earlier, this is also one of the more difficult species to keep alive because they only seem to eat naturally occurring algae that grows in the tank, not food you intentionally add. Moving on, and I want to talk about tank mates for Nerite snails. I've personally kept my Nerite snails in a wide variety of setups, including community tanks, fishless tanks that only have the Nerite snails and different types of shrimp in them. I've kept them in room temperature tanks, I've kept them in betta fish tanks and a few other setups too. With betta fish being so popular in the hobby right now, I just want to share my personal experience, and I've never once had one of my bettas go for the Nerite snails in their tank. But just like keeping shrimp with betta fish, it does seem that this comes down to the fish's individual personality. I've had 5 bettas now, all 5 have been very different to each other, and I've seen other people say that their betta fish will not tolerate snails in its tank. When it comes to my community tanks, they've been completely fine with all of the community tank friendly species that you can find in the hobby, such as different types of friendly tetra, rasbora, danios, minnows and things like that. They just don't have issues. Personally, I've never kept any varieties of loaches, pufferfish, cichlids or crayfish, but I have seen people say it's usually best to avoid those, or at least some species of them, because they can be prone to eating snails, so do specific research for those species of fish. And like I said earlier, when it comes to stocking, try and always factor in other species that may try and eat the same foods your Nerite snails are going to eat as well, to make sure there's plenty of food for them. So that includes things like Neocaridina shrimp, Armano shrimp, plecos, Siamese algae eaters, and otocinclus catfish and stuff like that will be eating the different types of biofilm and algae in the tank. But in my experience, Nerite snails really are an excellent little snail that'll eat a lot of algae in a tank with non-aggressive fish. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. Thanks for watching, I hope it's been helpful. Hopefully it wasn't too confusing, but I know it does get a little tricky when there's so many different snails within a single family with the same common name. Thanks for watching and good luck with your Nerite snails.